Good afternoon, everyone. This session is ready to begin. Andrea Clark from BerryDunn will moderate this session. Andrea, you have the floor.
Thank you, Charles. And welcome, everyone, to this breakout session on privacy and security and statistical de-identification. We've got a lot of great material to present to you this afternoon. So without further ado, let us begin with Scott Curley and Kathy Hines from CHIA. Scott Curley has served in a privacy compliance capacity with an emphasis on data release matters at CHIA since 2015, and previously worked as a private sector paralegal manager. Kathy Hines is the Senior Director of Partner Operations and Data Compliance at the Center for Health Information and Analysis in Massachusetts. And her role at CHIA, she governs the data intake and validation of the hospital and MA-APCD data sources using a unique key account customer service approach to ensure collaboration and promote quality and timely data submissions. She oversees the data quality team at CHIA, which is heavily involved in quality assurance of all of CHIA's data releases, as well as development of a new MA-APCD data analytics and reporting tool. She's also serving as a NADO board member. So Scott and Kathy.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Andrea, for that introduction. Kathy and I will be presenting today on the impact that data de-identification has on CHIA's Master Patient Index and data linkage services, Master Patient Index being its unique identifier for a person across the database. Next slide. I'm going to quickly outline why CHIA decided to make significant changes to the way it collects personally identifiable information and claims for its APCD, and then talk about some of the challenges to that process, and Kathy will get into the how we did all that. These changes broadly included some obfuscation and in some cases removal of patient identifiers at the site of the insurance carrier. And as part of that implementation, CHIA had to create a new master patient index that would still allow for linkage of patients across carriers and to external data sources. Next slide. Data privacy and the federal law 42 CFR Part 2, which protects the identity of individuals that receive substance use disorder treatment, are the primary motivating factors that caused CHIA to reassess how it was collecting PII. Despite a robust privacy and security policy, CHIA viewed an increasing cybersecurity threats to healthcare data and internal risks as potential and realistic exposures to confidential data. Further, 42 CFR Part 2 actually restricts the provisioning of identifiable substance use disorder data to state APCDs. And because of this, CHIA's collection of that data has been incomplete, and it severely limits the effectiveness of the APCD for certain important public health research in the Commonwealth, most notably responding effectively to the opioid crisis. Next slide. So going to an architecture without personally identifiable information obviously presents some analytical challenges. Most importantly, you would need to be able to connect healthcare data and encounters across payers to external data sets. And traditionally, you would need PII to do this. So the obvious question here is, how can we accomplish this without relying on things like names, social security numbers, dates of birth, the things we rely on to identify unique individuals? Next slide. So CHIA's solution to the problem relies on 4 integrated components: software that obfuscates direct patient identifying information, an architecture that never receives in the clear direct patient identifiers, updates to its carrier submissions to remove certain direct identifiers and certain quasi-identifiers, and a process that would still create one ID for each person regardless of the insurance carrier that would still be usable in linkage to external data. Next slide. So CHIA had successfully implemented a number of these components by 2017 that Kathy will describe later on, and accomplished largely its goal of reducing the collection of PII. But changes were made to 42 CFR Part 2 that took it out of a general privacy protection to one more aligned with the HIPAA de-identification rules. And this further restricted CHIA's ability to collect that substance use data that we had set a goal to be able to collect, despite our efforts to reduce PII. So with those changes, we felt that to collect that data, not only would we have to stop collecting PII, but data submissions would actually have to be HIPAA de-identified. Next slide. So the obvious question is, how can you collect data that's HIPAA de-identified without limiting the value of that data? I'm sure most of you are aware that HIPAA provides two ways to de-identify data. They're the expert determination and the safe harbor. Safe harbor is probably the one familiar to most of you. You remove the 18 identifiers and you're good to go. But this is a one-size-fits-all approach, but leads to the loss of elements that you're gonna want in your analysis, like dates of services, 5-digit zip codes, and dates of birth. So it's not always the best route from an analytic pursuit. So you could also use the expert determination approach, which uses a statistical method to measure the risk of re-identification and consider the specific context in which the data is collected and used, and hopefully retain those fields that you're looking to keep in your analysis. So CHIA identified the expert determination method as the approach that might allow us to keep important fields. Next slide. So CHIA contracted with On Point Health Data and Professor Brad Mallon, who assisted in creating a statistically de-identified data set. That process included the identification of direct and quasi-identifiers for inclusion and exclusion, a review of our whole data collection and dissemination practice, and we considered several approaches to de-identifying the data and the various trade-offs of those. Next slide. On Point and CHIA designed a data de-identification model that includes the suppression and generalization of various features associated with the data available for transmission. Validated that model to sufficiently mitigate re-identification risk over several years worth of APCD data. This model prioritized 5-digit zip code, states, the gender, birth, year, and month of members, and maintained full service dates. You can see in the graph here, the top trending line is the re-identification risk if CHIA applied a safe harbor policy, versus the bottom trending line, CHIA's chosen policy, which obviously is a risk level that's lower than safe harbor. Go ahead, Kathy.
Thank you, Scott. Hopefully everyone can hear me. I'm Kathy Hines, and now that Scott has given you some background information on why we took this approach to de-identification, I'm going to delve a little bit into technically how we accomplished these changes. The first piece is a proprietary software that CHIA created called FileSecure. FileSecure is used with our member eligibility submissions. Next slide. So the important thing to know about FileSecure is that it sits at the payer's site. CHIA does not have access to it at their site in any way. The payers run the eligibility file through FileSecure before sending the data to CHIA. The software takes the key personal identifiers and pseudonymizes them into 128-bit hashed value. The in the clear versions are never seen by CHIA. FileSecure has built-in edits and features to ensure data accuracy. For example, first name is run through a nickname process, last names run through a NICES algorithm, and social security numbers and dates are checked for proper format. Next slide. Further, to avoid putting too much work on the payers themselves, FileSecure will delete non-Massachusetts zip codes, map small area zip codes into neighboring zip codes, and flag invalid data. And a similar process happens on the states as well. Then finally, FileSecure encrypts the file with a NIST-compliant software before the data is sent to CHIA. Next slide. FileSecure, as I mentioned, is used on the eligibility files. However, CHIA collects a lot of PII, or collected a lot of PII on the claim files, and we had other PII fields on eligibility that weren't manipulated in FileSecure. That meant we had to update our submission guides. Next slide. A number of fields were removed from our submission guides and no longer collected from the payers. Most of those fields are listed here on this slide. Next slide. So this slide basically outlines the steps we have just discussed. In all the items in the large blue box occurs before the data is transported to CHIA. High-risk fields are removed from the submission files entirely. FileSecure edits, transforms, and masks personally identifiable fields, and encrypts the entire file before it is uploaded to CHIA. Next slide. Now that we have secured the data, we needed to turn our attention to how we are going to utilize the data in ways we were able to prior to the loss of fields and data masking. Next slide. So CHIA creates a master patient index, MPI, using a probabilistic matching algorithm with pseudonymized identifiers. The ID connects all records that are very likely the same person and assigns them a key that is not based in any way on PII or any other attributes of a person's data. Depending on what rights a user has been granted, they may access the MPI, the month and year of birth, and possibly the 5-digit zip code. CHIA then deployed a version of FileSecure to be used by external state agencies to allow CHIA to receive data from those agencies following the same rules, masking, and encryption as utilized with the masked APCD data. We can then use the pseudonymized data with our probabilistic matching engine to match data in a completely de-identified fashion. Next slide. So the data arrives at CHIA, and the next step is to create the master patient index. CHIA's landing zone represents where the data lands after the data is submitted to CHIA. In the data preparation, we filter out or transform any known data issues. During the data load, we load the data into the MPI engine. In loading the data, we have one cardinal rule. If the payer and the insurance member ID are the same, regardless of the other data, we consider them the same person. For each person, we will maintain the last 5 valid values for each field. We know people move, change names, transpose numbers, so expect that we will see some variation. The APCD algorithm, we employ a probabilistic matching method. We utilize 8 fields: the payer ID, which we call the org ID, the member's insurance number or ID, the member's first name, last name, date of birth, gender, social security number, and zip code. Now remember, the names, full date of birth, and social security number are masked fields. CHIA has no way to identify the actual names, dates, and SSNs. As I said, if the payer ID and the insurance ID match, we consider it the same person. However, this process is set to match not just within payers, but across payers, or within payers for members that for some reason have more than one ID. The algorithm uses a scoring technique on the other fields that our developers created after considerable research, trial, and error with our data. The end result is a master patient index hub with each person assigned an MEID. The data in the grid on the screen may be a bit difficult to read, but I do want to go through a couple of examples. In the first, in green, shows our first rule. During the data load, the records were found to have the same org ID and insurance ID. So we consider them the same person. We capture the last 5 values submitted for each field. So in this case, on every record, the first name, the date of birth, the gender, and the social security number were the same. The last name changed once. Perhaps the person had a name change due to a marriage. and the zip code changed 3 times, indicating possible moves. The second example in yellow shows 2 records coming from different payers. So the org ID and the insurance IDs are different. The records go through the same algorithm, and looking closer at the 2 records, we see that all the other fields except zip code match, and with the probabilistic matching rules, are scored high and found to be the same person. They are maintained as 2 records with the same MEID. Each org ID and member ID combination will maintain the last 5 values for each field. So you will see in the second record 3 values for zip code. These are just a couple of very simplistic examples, but I wanted to give you a flavor for how the master patient index works before I turn it over to Scott, who will talk about the linkage services. Scott, next slide.
Charles, in the interest of time, can you just skip over to slide 21 real quick? So I'm going to try to do this justice in the quick 1-minute version that we have left. Back up 1 slide, Charles. So we created a search process that pretty much replicates the master patient index. You'll see here in this graph that this looks exactly similar to how we collect carrier submissions. We review a project, we give the external party file secure and a technical document to prepare their data. The data is prepared through file secure and comes into CHIA, where we bump it up against our MPI hub and do a probabilistic match to find potential candidates. We do not get any personally identifiable information in this process. Charles, next slide. This slide really takes you a little bit under the hood into the weeds of the match process. You can see at the top you have an input record with obfuscated data, and the below records are records within CHIA's MPI hub that are potential matches. The first match being the highest match, matching on 4 out of the 5 out of 6 criteria, and lower matches and so on. We can move these thresholds for the data requester if they need them. At the end of the day, what you get back is a study ID and the claims, and no PII is exchanged. You jump to the last slide. So we've been using this model pretty successfully with our state partners, getting about mid-90s% match rate on member eligibility and finding these candidates. And the big takeaway here is that we're able to do this while providing comfort to those data submitters that they don't actually have to give us personally identifiable information. And some of these projects might not have happened, especially at the federal level, without that comfort. And that is our presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Scott and Kathy. Charles, do we have any timely questions in the chat?
Sorry, no, it doesn't look like we have any at this point.
Okay, all right, thanks very much. Moving on to our next presenter, Abigail Stamm is an epidemiologist for the New York State Department of Health Environmental Public Health Tracking Program, where she manages data for the NYS EPHT online portal and maintains the geographic aggregation tool. Abigail also serves on a CDC work group that is developing methods and standards to protect confidentiality when implementing small area aggregation, and is revising the aggregated areas for the NYS EPHT subcounty portal. Abby coordinates and runs workshops for DOH employees and university students on using R for data management, data analysis, and geographic information systems. Abby, when you're ready.
The Geographic Aggregation Tool, or GAT, is a free software tool that was developed as part of a CDC-funded Environmental Public Health Tracking grant. GAT was recently updated and is being used in the development of a new EPHT platform in New York State, which will show sub-county measures of health and exposure. It will be available online. This can help with the Department of Health to identify and better understand patterns and trends of disease at a higher resolution. In this presentation, I'll cover why sub-county aggregation is important and how GAT can help to address it. Counties want their residents' data at a higher granularity than county level, which can mask variation, especially if counties have a mix of urban and rural populations. However, showing data at town level won't work because many rural towns have very small populations. For example, In New York State, Hamilton County has 4,800 people, but they're spread across 9 towns. Areas with small populations are likely to have very few cases, which can lead to unstable rates and put confidentiality of cases at risk. We want to find a happy medium where numbers are large enough to protect confidentiality and provide stable rates, but areas are small enough that we can show rate variation. This will allow local health departments and others to use the rates to identify hotspots for targeted interventions. One way that we can do this is to aggregate small areas, such as towns or census tracts. We chose to aggregate census tracts so that we could combine smaller towns as well as creating smaller areas within large cities so that we could also display urban variation. We developed GAT to standardize and automate how we aggregate New York's 4,900 census tracts. GAT reads in areas with small counts, such as population, deaths, or cases, and combines them until those counts meet the user's desired minimum value. At the end, GAT provides a log and other outputs that can help the user to record and repeat the settings that they used. This allows users to map stable rates and also to explain to shareholders how they developed the areas that they're displaying. There are 4 different aggregation methods included in GAT so that you can decide which method provides the most meaningful results for your data. I'll cover those shortly. GAT is run through the free statistical software program R. In this version, we've converted it to a standalone package or add-on for R. To make it as user-friendly as possible, we've developed a series of dialogues that can help you to select your settings. For the map shown, I ran New York State towns through GAT. This map was produced by GAT and it shows the following information. Red borders show town boundaries and black borders show aggregated area boundaries. I chose a minimum population of 6,000 and a maximum population of 15,000. I aggregated each area with a population below 6,000 to its neighbor with the closest population-weighted centroid. Besides a PDF of maps, the new version of GAT produces 2 shapefiles, an aggregated file and a crosswalk. GAT also produces a log of the entire process that includes settings, any warnings that you might have gotten, and a brief data dictionary. The PDF and log provide much more information than what I'm covering in this presentation and are designed to help you to evaluate and report your aggregation results and to standardize your process. GAT requests user inputs through a series of dialogues, including menus, checkboxes, and text boxes, so that no programming knowledge is necessary. The screenshot is the final step of the user input section, where a user can verify that the information that they entered is correct. The ability to return to previous steps is also a new feature in GAT. The screenshot contains all settings that the user has entered, so someone else could recreate the results just from this image. At this point, when the user clicks confirm, GAT proceeds to the aggregation, which can take between seconds and hours depending on the shapefile size and the settings that you use. 2 progress bars will be displayed so that the user knows that GAT has not stalled. GAT contains 4 aggregation methods and several basic and advanced settings that allow you to refine these methods further. The screenshot shows the dialog to select your aggregation method. Using these options, you can decide which aggregation method would be the most meaningful for the data that you intend to show. In my previous example, I used closest population-weighted centroid, which might work well for disease rates, but what if you want to investigate something else? To study an environmental exposure, like air pollution, you might choose to use geographic centroids. To maximize the number of areas, you might aggregate to the neighbor with the lowest count. To investigate social determinants of health, you might want to aggregate to the most similar neighbor based on a ratio of 2 values. The next series of graphics show GAT's aggregation process. For all methods, GAT begins with the area with the highest count below the minimum desired value. Here, the minimum desired value is 5. The area with the highest count below 5 is E, with a count of 3. In this example, we are aggregating by the closest geographic centroid, the red diamonds. The closest neighbor to E is C, so GAT assigns E to merge with C. With this method, each time 2 areas are aggregated, the new centroid becomes the mean of the previous 2. This does speed up GAT a lot, but it can result in centroids that do not quite match the area center, which you can see here. This method provides the most compact areas and can work well for environmental exposures like air pollution and temperature. In this example, GAT evaluates population-weighted centroids, the blue circles. Once again, GAT begins with area E. GAT determines that the closest neighbor is D, so GAT assigns E to merge with D. With this method, GAT reads in a second shapefile, for example, a census block file, in order to calculate the initial population weighted centroids. GAT then takes a weighted average of the centroids each time two areas are aggregated. This speeds up GAT again, but it can result in centroids that do not match the population center. For example, in a test run of New York State census tracts using weighted centroid averages took about 40 minutes, but when recalculating the population weighted centroid for each area, it took about 3.5 hours. This method provides areas that may sprawl a bit, but they should be representative of population centers and can work well for disease rates. In this example, GAT again begins with area E. GAT evaluates E's neighbors' populations to determine the neighbor with the lowest population, which is D. So GAT assigns E to merge with D. With this method, each area is aggregated to its neighbor with the lowest value. This method provides the largest number of areas, therefore it has the greatest granularity. However, it can result in weird snaky shapes and possibly donuts where a rural area entirely surrounds an urban one. You can see that here with ADE surrounding most of C. Here, GAT evaluates ratios to determine the most similar neighbor. Once more, GAT begins with E. E's ratio is 0, which is more similar to D than to A or C, so GAT assigns E to merge with D. With this method, each area is aggregated to the neighbor with the most similar ratio of two values, for example, Hispanic and non-Hispanic. This method works well if you want to create areas of similar populations to investigate social determinants of health. If you've used GAT before, then this slide shows some of the changes that we've made. If you have questions about these changes, please feel free to follow up after the presentation. In this example, the New York State EPHT program is developing an online portal, as I mentioned at the beginning, to display various disease rates at sub-county level. For our project, we ran 2 aggregations. For both aggregations, we excluded census tracts with 0 population and census tracts in which at least 50% of the population lives in group quarters. That black boot shape in the middle is the University at Albany dormitories, which were excluded as group quarters. For the first aggregation, we merged within town boundaries to a minimum of 7,500 population. For the second aggregation, we merged towns below 7,500 population to other small towns within the same county. In our evaluations, we determined that requiring a population of at least 7,500 results in stable rates for most areas, while providing meaningful detail within counties and larger cities. In this example, published in Population Health Metrics, the researchers used a previous version of GAT to aggregate census tracts by number of deaths to at least 60 deaths per area. Their goal was to create life expectancies with low standard errors. GAT provides many options that you can customize to create small areas that are meaningful to you and your stakeholders, provide stable rates for whatever you're measuring, and protect patient confidentiality. GAT automatically produces documentation to help you keep track of and reproduce your process, share your methodology with others, and evaluate which settings will best meet your needs. We hope to make GAT available online soon. In the meantime, if you think that GAT can help you with your work, please email me and I can send you a copy of the package and instructions to get you started.
Thank you very much, Abby. That was fantastic. I did have one question for you that I'd like to ask before we move on to our third presentation. For any of our audience members who might be less familiar with geographic GIS programs and so forth, could you explain what a shapefile is and how it works?
A shapefile is actually a set of 4 to 7 files that, when read into a GIS program like ArcGIS or QGIS, will display a map layer and corresponding information. Mm-hmm. Usually one of the files will be the data table that goes with the layer, one file will be the layer itself, one file will be the projection to tell it what zone to read it in or what latitude, longitude. Mm-hmm. These all combined allow you to map out whatever information that you're trying to show.
Okay, thank you. So, and you mentioned that one of the inputs to GAT is a shapefile. Are there public sources for these to get you started in general, or how does one construct an input file?
There are a lot of sources for shapefiles. A lot of the ones that we use come from the US Census, from their Tiger Line shapefiles website.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. And I don't see any questions in the Q&A. We will have some time for questions after our final presentation. Our final presentation is by Bill Bailey, who has served as the Chief Privacy Officer of the Massachusetts Center for Health Information and Analysis since January of 2016, and previously worked in the privacy and compliance areas for the Massachusetts Department of Health. He is a graduate of Dartmouth College and the Boston University School of Law.
Thank you for that introduction, Andrea, and thank you to Abigail and Scott and Kathy for the presentations before me. If you're at this conference, you probably already know that health data organizations face a number of shared challenges in the collection, cleaning, analysis, and release of highly sensitive and confidential health data. Our agency is aware of the need to responsibly protect individual privacy when our CHIA data is released. Accordingly, in recent years, CHIA has chosen to take a closer look at what happens to our APCD and hospital data after it leaves our agency and goes to approved external data recipients. Next slide, please. In order to be good stewards of our unconsented and potentially identifiable health data, CHIA chose to take a look into what very basic audits might reveal about how well our data recipients were complying with our data use agreement requirements. As CHIA has been releasing its APCD data for several years to dozens of unique data recipients at this point, it was a concern that our data use agreements were not routinely nor comprehensively verified for compliance, as our data use agreements contain typical and familiar privacy provisions, but also contains several requirements driven by Massachusetts-specific regulation provisions. We felt it would be very useful to see how our data users were doing. Next slide. First, for a word on our data use agreements, I think that's in order. In addition to the HIPAA-informed basic DUA provisions that you would find protecting any limited data set, our DUA document incorporates by reference both a data management plan approved by our Chief Information Security Officer and the approved data use application reviewed by our regulatory approval bodies consistent with our regulation criteria and ultimately approved by our executive director. Importantly, the approved data use application states that specific research project for which the data can be used and describes it. Describes the methodology and the purpose, and that is the limited purpose that the data can be used for. The DUA then requires that data recipients obtain signed confidentiality agreements in favor of CHIA from every individual with data access prior to the data access being granted, and states that data recipients will track data access for all users in a very basic data access log, so we know who had access to which data when. Data users agree to limit the use of the data to the limited purpose stated in the approved data application, and to only link CHIA data to listed pre-approved outside data elements. The DUA by its terms only authorizes publication consistent with the approved research project purpose, and any disclosure of CHIA data must be both aggregate and cell suppressed to the CMS standard. That is, no cell size less than 11 is permitted. The DUA, through the data management plan, imposes basic security protections, among them the requirement that CHIA data may neither change location without prior approval, nor may it be transferred except by approved secure means. Importantly, data recipients agreed to destroy all copies of CHIA data upon completion of the research project, and to certify this data destruction to CHIA in writing. Next slide. Our audit process has evolved somewhat since it began in 2016. But a foundational principle has always been that, absent some evidence of DUA noncompliance, the process should be simple and straightforward to avoid unreasonable burden on our busy and professional universe of research professionals. In this spirit, our first iteration of audits was a simple one-page checkbox survey sent directly to the lead researcher with no signature required on the response. This was a fact-finding exercise of sorts. Our second phase, for a number of reasons I will explain later, expanded to require submission of routine supporting documents, confidentiality agreements, data access logs, data destruction certificates, and also to require signatures first by the lead researcher, and then later also by an organizational representative, typically within the Office of Sponsored Research, and by an individual responsible for institution data security. Importantly, and by design, our second phase audit response remained a one-page checkbox form. Next slide. So what did our data audit responses tell us? Phase 1 responses showed little need for formal corrective action. The large number of surveys that we sent out for that first phase reflected a moment of time that was catch-up from prior year data users who had not yet certified that they had completed their projects and destroyed all CHIA data. Interestingly, simply sending out those data audit survey forms led CHIA to note a significant number of data recipients who were then, and only then, prompted to destroy data for projects that were then certified as completed. This constituted slightly over 20% of the recipients. An unnecessary inherent risk was posed by that data that we felt was still floating around out there without any ongoing research purpose. And this informed CHIA's decision to require supporting documentation and sign-offs on future iterations of our data audit survey forms. The results then revealed a higher incidence rate of more significant non-compliance concerns when those signatures were required by data users in subsequent phases, and when supporting documentation of the most basic kind was requested. Next slide. I realize that our rather humble numbers on that last slide lack the scope and research richness of typical research projects that use NADO type data, but our experience does tell a meaningful story nevertheless. What we observed when just doing an unsigned attestational audit response was that very few data users self-reported any non-compliance issues at all. Good on the surface, but CHIA did yield a significant number of responses that showed late data destruction and certification. We also observed a very strong correlation between timely audit responses and strong compliance. Late responses had an outsized correlation with EUA noncompliance, an early warning signal in many cases. Late responses also needed multiple follow-up efforts to yield a completed audit response. So late responses in a number of ways can tell you early that there are problems. We also observed that when the audit response required provision of supporting documents and sign-off by the researcher, and then later with additional sign-offs by institutional officials and security representatives, the self-reporting rate of noncompliance increased meaningfully. It is likely that the higher degree of scrutiny led to more careful audit responses. Even in this case, the strong correlation between late phase 2 audit responses and DUA noncompliance remains strong. Again, that late response can be a signal that something is afoot. The percentage of respondents who were prompted to destroy their CHIA data and certified that to that destruction was also similar, just under 25%, similar to the phase 1 responses at around 20%. So what we learned is simply by doing an audit, we can track down, locate data that doesn't need to be out there anymore, that could be destroyed. Next slide. What were the areas of DUA noncompliance observed by CHIA? We noted a variety of concerns, which included that lack of timely audit response. When responses ultimately were received, the failure to destroy data was a consistent concern, but another problem was a failure by the organization and lead researcher to obtain signed confidentiality agreements and maintain basic data access logs. Interestingly, the latter, if maintained, would likely have alerted project leaders in real time to non-compliance issues before any audit response. So we find the data access log is a useful thing to insist on just as a guide to prompt people to do the confidentiality agreements and to track who has access. CHIA did also learn of isolated instances where data used strayed into unapproved research areas. This is a particular problem under our state regulations, which restrict use of data to purposes that have been determined to serve the public interest. Our data is not there for use for any purpose that the research team conceives of after getting approved for data release. And also, on several occasions, it involved linkage to unapproved data elements that may have potentially elevated risk to to individual privacy. We were fortunate in the cases that we had that there was not a bigger risk to privacy, but still we insist on linkage to only the elements that have been pre-approved. Some publication parameters were not met, and in some cases, responses showed data movement and migration that was not fully consistent with the approved data management plan representations made by the organization. Next slide. Without going into detail that this format doesn't allow, our findings led to an internal review of appropriate response to each concern or violation. In short, we met within CHIA to find out what the appropriate thing to do was to the agency that did not comply fully with the DUA provisions. Our responses ran the gamut from informal communication with research teams or with the institutional oversight staff. In a few cases where greater risk was a concern, a formal corrective action plan was required of the institution to clarify DUA responsibility and to institute formal internal review processes to protect data use going forward. In limited, isolated instances, more significant intervention was indicated and was implemented. Next slide. Our lessons learned in this process were very valuable to us. First, the audit process confirmed what we suspected from the outset, namely that the bulk of our data user community uses and protects the data responsibly and consistent with the data use agreement terms. Thank you for that. Nevertheless, data audits may be useful to other agencies in identifying how well your data release DUAs are being complied with, as it was for us. Audits become more revealing when they include a requirement for multiple party sign-offs and include supporting documentation submission requirements. One side note concerns graduate student research use. Students receiving CHIA data do so only through a faculty submitted application. We don't just release data directly to students. And even then, because students often change academic institutions in more than one case, our audit showed that data migration had not been pre-approved nor signed off on by the receiving institution when a student goes there. We also learned that some data recipients wrongly assumed that all DUAs are alike, leading to a surprise when noncompliance with our state-specific DUA provisions were noted. In the end, CHIA was able to conclude that our best next step, aside from continuing the routine audit program, would be to design and distribute an optimal, direct, and basic educational presentation to proactively educate our data users and proactively help institutions avoid these pitfalls. Teachable moments are, after all, less effective when lesson does not follow. So CHIA's next step in this audit process is a second step of education. Next slide. For other entities that release sensitive and confidential data, we would share our conclusion that an audit process can usefully assess how well protected your released data really is. We suggest it's wise to keep the audit scope form minimally burdensome in the absence of significant evidence of noncompliance. We counsel in favor of engaging and involving the entire organization that receives the data in the audit process, as research is often separate and compartmentalized from oversight and data security functions. CHIA releases data to organizations and not individual research teams, so this informs our process. We see benefit in being flexible in working with institutions and crafting remedies to noncompliance, appropriate to the nature of the concern and the risk involved. Please let us know your thoughts and know we would like to learn of your similar experiences in audit and compliance activity. Final slide. You can reach us probably best at email in times of pandemic with any questions you might have to share your experiences. I did see that one question came up that people would like to potentially see our audit form. If you shoot us an email, we'd be glad to share that with you. With that, I turn it back to you, Andrea.
Thank you very much, Bill. Just another question that had sprung to mind from, well, first of all, I should ask Charles, or do we have any questions coming through in chat or on the Q&A?
Yes, we do. I can read the first question for you. The first question is of CHIA. Can CHIA share a copy of the audit form that you use?
Yes, we'd be glad to do so. If anybody sends a request by email to either Scott Curley, who works closely with me on this and co-authored the presentation, or to me, we'll be glad to get that to you. Simple one-page form, but again, it'll give you an idea of exactly what we asked for.
And do you have a standard period of time for researchers to use data, or is data destruction based on researcher self-identification and project completion?
Phil, I'll take this one real quick.
Go right ahead, Scott.
We used to have a time limit, but it was all, as you know, as researchers, it's always hard to figure out when you're going to finish your research. So we often were going back and forth to extend dates, and it just became burdensome. So there isn't a timeline. The obligation is on the researcher to self-identify the destruction of the data within 30 days of the completion of the project. And it's also the reason why we also prefer to do the audits on a yearly basis. It serves as a reminder to those people who are doing research that if they haven't destroyed their data, they should.
One reason why it's difficult for us to have a standard period in addition to that is that a number of our research projects involve longitudinal studies. And so with ongoing year-to-year release of data, it's kind of a moving target as to when the project might stop or when the publication results might issue.
Andrea, there's one more question for Scott and Kathy. Are string similarity measures used in probabilistic matching? And how much would matching improve if string similarity were used on unhashed versions of fields like names or social security numbers?
Sure. So no, because we're using pseudonymized data, we aren't able to do the string approach where, you know, somebody transposed their date of birth by a day, or their last name was off by one letter. We aren't able to do that. However, because we actually had data prior to our latest approach with in the clear numbers, in the clear names, we were able to do a lot of trial and error to make sure we were getting close. So using that and using the edits that we do put on the data before it goes through the file secure process, before it's pseudonymized, where we do the last name NIST function, nicest function, we do a function on first name, and we also make sure that at least the dates are in a date format. The social security number is in an SSN format. It is in 8 digits instead of 9. That helps a lot. And so we found that it's really good. Would it be better if you could do it on the raw data? Maybe a little, sure. But we've gotten really close. When we use the approach with other agencies and their data is coming in through the same process of being pseudonymized, we're getting great match rates. I think in DPH, Scott, we're getting over 90% match rates for some things, right?
Yeah.
So we are finding that the way we're doing it is working.
Kathy? Actually, following up on that question, I had wondered about sort of quasi-identifiers and how you handle the risks of very rare diagnoses or perhaps well-publicized incidents that could be used to identify individuals' care histories despite the PII being hashed.
So it's part of the approach that we took with OnPoint to look at data that we could keep and had to lose or had to pseudonymize. They actually recommended a number of diagnosis codes that if this substance use disorder data is present, we had to remove. So most of these were, they were things that related to birth diagnoses because you could find a birth announcement possibly in the paper, or things that involved a catastrophic event such as a terrorist attack or some huge weather event. And in some cases, we did have to map to more generic codes. There were some weight-related codes that we had to go to a more generic version of the weight code. So, and that is reviewed every year.
Thanks. And so, and that actually, so it's the annual reassessment process that looks at those sorts of, are there incidents that we need to control for, that sort of thing? Anything else you'd care to expand upon about the reassessment?
Yeah, each year we do a reassessment with OnPoint. They're given the latest data, so there's always a new year of data available. And they go through their same tests, they go through their same algorithms to make sure that we're still within the safe harbor. And that's when something might happen that we would have to add a diagnosis code. The one example I can give is when we started this, we were still getting the self-insured data. At the next year, the first year that we no longer had the self-insured data, OnPoint found that we needed to map about, I think it was about 10 zip codes, I think, Scott, that we had to include in the mapping, because now they were just a little bit too small of an area. So there's some of that. There's also, if CHIA wants to change something, we wanted to add a non-Massachusetts resident flag this past year. So we let OnPoint know that, and they factor changes of that sort into their algorithms to make sure that they don't negatively impact the assessment.
Thanks.
Anything to add, Scott?
No, I think that's just the takeaway, is that the reassessment process, looks at the data from the approach that the population is dynamic, it's changing, so you always have to be reassessing the risks.
Right. Thanks. Abby, my next question is for you. I was wondering if GAT will work with user-defined geographies like neighborhoods or health service areas.
As long as it is in a polygon shapefile format, it will. And there's documentation provided that gives you the specifics about other variables that need to be in the data table.
That I noticed in this presentation that you mentioned this, that the GAT was particularly useful for studying phenomena with fairly stable rates. And I was just wondering if you had any tips, tricks, and advice for those studying phenomena with perhaps more unstable rates, stuff that's varying over time or across geography more so than you might like.
We originally started developing GAT because we wanted to address unstable rates, and we wanted to be able to show as much data as possible, because as the presenters from CHIA mentioned, when you have very small numbers, often you have to suppress them. So our first step was to aggregate areas to make a larger area and combine people that way. Another thing that we do is to aggregate years so that we might show data in 3-year intervals or in 5-year intervals.
Thank you. We had a question for Scott and Kathy come through in the chat. It says, is your 90% plus match for all subgroups, that is by, say, race, ethnicity, age, or so forth, or is one subgroup less likely to be matched?
I don't know of an example where we've tried to break out these match rates by demographics such as race and ethnicity. Interest, the APCD doesn't collect that type of information at present. You're not going to be able to match people who just aren't in the data. Is the problem. So if you think about, if your population is inmates, well, you're not going to find inmates in the all-payer claims database because it's completely paid for by the state and not submitted to the APCD. But if they get public or private insurance and they are not self-insured, we're matching at about 93 to 94% of those people you submit to us.
And another question coming into the chat, this one for Abby, is GAT available publicly?
Not yet. It is available if you email me and ask. It's in beta testing right now, so we're not ready to release it on the web. We are planning, when it is ready, to release it both on CRAN, which is our archive for our packages, as well as either through the Department of Health or University at Albany.
Thank you. Bill, I was wondering what CHIA's most important messages coming out of the audit process are for data recipients.
Sure. If your agency is releasing sensitive or confidential data to third parties, The message, again, is that you could be well served by instituting an audit process. Not necessarily the same one we have, but just the areas of concern that are particular to your data release process. Just letting people know that you're looking and not hitting them over the head with a sledgehammer, but just asking questions about how the data use and security is going. I think has a tendency naturally to keep people appropriately on their toes and honest. And you get a sense of how well people are doing. It's all well and good to put a protective data use agreement in place, but if you have reason to believe that your policy or your agreement is not being complied with, you probably have an obligation and a duty to do something about that. And so I think that was the thing that we learned, was that we had a high level of compliance, but we had a not insignificant level of concern. You can consider the benefits of conducting the audits with the receiving organization itself. Research teams are interested in doing research, and often for a variety of reasons, you get better compliance responses when you involve the Office of Sponsored Research or some other administrative level of oversight. And on questions that relate to security, if the security team knows that you have particular concerns, or if they're reminded that they have ongoing obligations rather than just getting the data released to them, that can be very helpful. It just results in a more rigorous and thoughtful set of protections and responses we found. I think the last important message part of that is, when you do find that there are people and flexible in your response, there's no one size fits all response. And depending on what the level of risk is and what the prior history is with the data recipient, you can take a variety of corrective steps to remedy any concerns you have.
Thanks. Was Chia surprised by the results, or any pleasant surprises in Japan?
I think one pleasant surprise was how cooperative and responsive organizations were when there were concerns that were brought to their attention. I don't think that's a huge surprise. We are dealing with professional researchers and organizations that are concerned not only with doing the right thing, but with their reputation. But once the appropriate support people were involved, privacy officers, information security staff, legal staff, or sponsored research personnel, we were really struck by how efficient and thoughtful those responses turned out to be.
Okay, thanks all. Charles, I'm not looking, it doesn't look like I'm seeing any additional questions in chat or Q&A. Does that sound right to you?
Yes,
Okay.
that's correct.
Okay, and do we have any announcements as we wrap up here?
Yeah.
We spent through the matching process at the very end, and about that. Certainly feel free to reach out to Kathy or I. We can talk in more detail about that. It's a very technical process, and you can talk about it at a high level, or you can talk about it at a very granular level. And to get through that in the time allotted can be a challenge. So
Definitely.
Let me just thank all of the presenters and thank Andrea for moderating. I have a couple of quick reminders. One, take an opportunity to visit the exhibit hall. You get points for if you're an exhibitor, or if you interact with the exhibitors, and then there's a drawing tomorrow. So take an opportunity to do that if you get a chance. And then wanted to remind you all that there's a session survey linked in Excel events. And then lastly, I posted to the feed and to the chat recently a sign up for the post-conference workshop on innovative analytics and multi-state collaboration. So if you want to sign up for that, please do so. It's October 1st and 2nd, just as a heads up.
Thank you so much, Charles. I did want to just check in about one thing. So it seems from the communications we've received that we're using the Excel events portal as was intended for the conference, but for the sessions themselves, we're exporting to Zoom. So everything else about how we're accessing the conference is the same as intended with Excel events.
Yeah, so we'll still continue to share information through there.
Okay.
Yeah, and there's also the networking sessions will be done through there. There are some of those this evening too.
Okay, great. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, all.